Okay, and we are live. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining us for this webinar session about private 5G for IoT. We're here today to talk about progress in the private 5G market, specifically in connection with the Internet of Things, which is where this private 5G story is most impactful, I would argue, and also most interesting. Today's session is called Private 5G for IoT, plotting timelines, defining applications, and making bets, which tells you straight off that our panel today will look at where we are with private 5G and where we're going with it, and explain this in terms of the use cases and applications that are being put live now, and those that will come to define it in the medium term. Along the way, we will hazard some guesswork, I suppose, about the likely winners and losers in this whole story. My name is James Blackman. I'm an editor with RCR Wireless. For those that don't know, I used to edit Enterprise IoT Insights, which was integrated into RCR at the start of the year. And if that big IoT topic was your thing, the beat remains the same and you are in the right place. I am your chair for today's session, which is brought to you by RCR Wireless in association with Syniverse, which claims the industry's, quote, only complete and fully integrated product line to implement transformational technologies. As such, Syniverse brings an important dimension to this discussion about the global interplay of private and public 5G for the IoT sector. Some housekeeping before we begin. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available on demand later today. The slides and the presentations are available to program registrants after the event. We will have time in the second half of the session to take questions. I'd encourage you to submit those at any time using the Q&A dialog box in the Zoom platform. We'll come to them as we can. I note as well, the panel will switch their cameras on and go to video for the Q&A section. We will just run with audio and slides until that point. Okay, the first thing to do is to introduce our panel. We have three fantastic, deeply knowledgeable, highly opinionated speakers today, which will present in turn before we go to the Q&A session. So I'd like to introduce, in order of appearance, Leo Geggs, Principal Analyst with ABI Research. Leo, I'm sure will be familiar to you if you follow the private 5G story, and if you follow the way we tell it. He leads ABI's 5G Markets and Enterprise Research Service. We also have Jagadish Dantaluri, who is General Manager for Private and Dedicated Networks at test and measurement company Keysight Technologies. Jagadish is also well known in this private 5G space, and his company is selling test equipment to just about every horizontal and vertical sector that is playing with private 5G currently. So Jagadish knows, if anyone knows, what is live and what is being tested on private 5G networks in enterprises today. I'd also like to introduce Kathiravan Kandasamy from Syniverse. Kathiravan, or KK, is Vice President of Product Development at Syniverse. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we will hear from you each shortly. A quick look at the agenda today, just so everyone is aware of the order of service. Each of our panelists will present for 7 or 8 minutes on the subject of private 5G for IoT. I will let each of them introduce themselves properly and say something about their companies and their views on all of this. We'll then go to a Q&A session in the second half. We are down for an hour, so we should have plenty of time for questions. Like I say, please ask them as we go, and we will get to them after the presentations. Something about RCR Wireless as well. This is boilerplate stuff really, but to give you some background, RCR Wireless has been around since before the dawn of time, practically, certainly as long as this mobile industry. It was founded in 1981, 1982, and is your go-to for news, interviews, and insights about all things wireless. As I said, As of the start of the year, RCR Wireless integrated enterprise IoT insights, as well as sometime previously in-building tech. So it is now a one-stop for news and views on digital change within the wireless sector itself, and how digital change is being sold to the rest of the world as well, if that makes sense. The target audience is everyone in tech and telecoms and every enterprise vertical buying from tech and telecoms. You can find us online variously. Just to say as well that we write lots of reports, and today's session will be followed with a long form editorial report on the same subject, which will summarize and kind of extend the discussion in this webinar today. This slide actually shows reports that were published by Enterprise IoT Insights previously through to the end of 2022. The new report on private 5G for IoT will more closely follow the story that all of these tell, more than perhaps your traditional RCR fare. But you can see lots here on private 5G and IoT, and they're all available online and they're free to download, so check them out. Right, back to the agenda and the subject at hand. We start with Leo from ABI Research, who can run a SWOT analysis of sorts for us on the state of the private 5G market. So Leo, thanks for joining. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, James. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm just here to give you, or want to use the next few minutes to give a brief overview of where we are with private 5G and where we are specifically with private 5G for IoT. So with that said, let's look at the private 5G first of all. So we've done analysis, we've done forecasts, right? And we're looking at, by 2030, we're looking at an overall market for private 5G specifically, of a bit more than $50 billion US. To complete the picture, I think you have to say that if you add the 4G LTE aspect to it, we're talking about roughly twice as much. So by essentially 2030, 2031 kind of area, we're reaching a break-even point. At least that's what we're expecting right now. So we're reaching this break-even point, or not break-even point, but turn point, where private 5G will take over 4G. As of now, we see a few interesting changes in the drivers. Previously, or the traditional value proposition has been around URLLC, time-sensitive networking, and massive machine type communication. So all of these very traditional use cases, or all of these capabilities that would enable automating and digitizing operational technology and OT data. But what we see right now is, specifically as we're talking about release 15 at the moment, and anything around release 15 capabilities in private 5G, private cellular in general, is a shift in this value proposition. So we're looking at what can be done with enhanced mobile broadband capabilities. So particularly, to put it in colloquial terms, a particularly large data pipe that can't be done with other wireless connectivity technologies. And in that case, we're seeing that the market is mainly driven by large outdoor areas, or enterprises with large outdoor areas, where private cellular is just a much more efficient way, or you can cover area in a much more efficient way with much less infrastructure than you can do with Wi-Fi. And we're talking about the factor 10, or even sometimes even more than factor 10. So you see a lot of demand coming from verticals like energy generation, for example, logistics, because that's why we consider ports and airports within manufacturing as well. Key bottlenecks continue to be Release 16 and 17 capable industrial grade chipsets and devices. They're beginning to emerge, and that's why I'm stressing the industrial grade in here, is that for the consumer market and for consumer devices, we're talking about, we have Release 16 capable chipsets already in the market, mainly driven by Qualcomm. But specifically when we're talking about industrial grade and enterprise features, we're not quite there yet. We're expecting, I mean, towards the end of last year, there was talk around Q4 2023, where the first of these chipsets and devices should emerge, reaching scale in the first quarter of 2024. So that's the view on private 5G in general. Now let's look at specific view on IoT in the next slide, which is essentially the competition is fierce. So 5G has to compete with a lot of IoT technologies on mainly price point. Because let's face it, when I talk to enterprises, and I've done this a lot in recent trade shows, different kind of forums, different panels, is what drives the decision to invest in a given technology is the price. And this is where 5G as an umbrella technology will have to come down first in the immediate future, in the short term, because as an umbrella technology to combine different use cases, talk about IoT, mobility, and positioning, is not there yet. We're talking about, and this has to do with the bottleneck of really 16, 17, or even 18 when you talk about positioning. That 2 centimeter level positioning is not there yet. So at this point in time, 5G has to compete more or less directly with already well-established IoT connectivity technologies, mainly on a price point. So that's where all hopes seem to be on RedCap at the moment, which is essentially 5G reduced RedCap is short for reduced capability, designed for use cases that on the one hand lie somewhere between the traditional 5G use cases that have been discussed in terms of availability or high availability, reliability, and URLLC features, but require more licensed spectrum and more deterministic networking than can be offered by current narrowband IoT technologies, for example, LTE-based IoT technologies, for example. So you're talking about anything like wearables, smartwatches, that kind of thing, industrial wireless sensors, and video surveillance. Now, obviously, the expectation is that by reducing the capabilities of 5G, narrowing them down to essentially enhanced mobile broadband capabilities with the deterministic networking features that cellular brings in properly licensed spectrum over any kind of IoT connectivity, will bring down the prices. and prices will have to come down. I hear that in an ideal scenario, price of a private cellular solution should at least come down to as much as twice the price of for example, industrial Wi-Fi at the moment, which would already be a considerable reduction, but would still also be a considerable, a quite significant cost factor, right? So a lot has to be done on that front. When you're talking about timeline, the expectations briefly, I mean, from a standardization point of view, we're pretty much there. Release 17, which standardizes a lot of the important capabilities or features of 5G RedCap, has been frozen, as you say, in 3GPP language last year, in March last year already. And in a typical cycle, we would expect devices, chipsets and devices to follow about 1.5 years after the respective standardization work had been finished. But we've seen that with release 16 already, that partly due to COVID, partly due to chipset as semiconductor manufacturers being more interested in features in the consumer domain. This does not necessarily hold. So we're talking, in the end, we're talking about, I would expect at least 2 years, not 2 years delay, but 2 years offset. So talking about 2024, 2020, end of 2024, kind of area.
Leo, let me just interrupt. I think we'll pick up on some of these points, and that's very interesting.
That was me done anyways.
Oh, perfect. Okay, apologies to assume that you were going to go on, but no, that's perfect. Okay, so that's very interesting. I think that some of these stats around the midterm forecasts and healthcare, I think are very interesting there, and also we will get back into some of this RedCap stuff. But without further ado, and because time is of the essence, we are going to hand over to Jagadish from Keysight, who is going to talk about the importance of test and measurement, which in the case of industrial IoT, I'm guessing is everything and is of critical importance. So Jagadish, let's have the Keysight.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. You have given a great introduction at the beginning. I'll just add, I lead this group at Keysight Technologies, and I'm also acting chairman for the working group 2 at 5G ACIA, a group that brings the operational technology players and also the industrial ICT players to work in the industrial private networks. Having said that, thank you everyone in joining today's session. Next slide, please, James. So let me briefly introduce the private networks life cycle. It's very similar to the commercial networks, but the players are quite different, and the number of stakeholders have grown a lot. It always starts with the build phase, in which phase the industrial device vendors, such as the ones who are developing human-machine interfaces, or the 5G gateways, or the industrial tools such as stock machines with 5G modems, screwdrivers with 5G modems, or companies like Syniverse, who play a critical role in providing an interface between the public networks and the private networks for the handovers and the mobility. And these guys do the research, develop, and they make their solution go through the validation and certification. That's phase 1. And once those things are ready, the next phase, the players like the systems integrators, be it IBM, Kyndryl, Capgemini, or maybe the operators themselves, take these solutions, design the networks for the industrial use cases, deploy these solutions, and also make sure that the end-to-end QoE, the quality of experience, meets the industrial use case specifications, and get the site accepted, and then start running the networks. In the last phase, which is the run phase, basically the stakeholders can be the end customers, such as, let's say, Ford, GM, or Tesla, or some other discrete manufacturing companies, or maybe the process industry companies. These guys take the solutions and run the solutions, or maybe the managed solution providers run the solutions. Each of these phases have unique challenges. Next slide, please, James. So each phase will have specific challenges, right? For example, in the build phase, as I said, the critical requirements go far beyond the consumer devices. Maybe the latency has to be good. They have to make sure that the interference impact on their operations is less, or the handling of some of these tools they basically are used in a very harsh environment. For example, the tools in an assembly plant, they get dropped, etc., etc. And so the tools for the research, design, validation, and certification has to be there to get the best quality out of these solutions. Some of the things can be the RF environment. In the industrial environment is quite different. The antenna performance has to be best. The channel modeling, which is the RF environment between a device and the G node B, has to be good. Tomorrow, the TSN will be adopted, and the security and interoperability. All these things has to be ensured during the build phase. And once it comes to the deploy, now it's a completely new world. During the deployment, of course, it has to be designed based on the end industrial environment. The spectrum has to be cleared with no interference, jamming, and of course, the end-to-end device capacity performance has to be tested, and then it has to be handed it over to the managed solution providers, or maybe to the end customer. When the network is deployed and handed it over to the end customer to run, on day 0, the QoE might be very good, but one need to ensure that the QoE is quite good on day 30 or day 60, etc. For that to happen, the network has to be monitored continuously, and it also the data has to enable to do the diagnostics if there is any problem, and maybe useful for the predictive analytics. For all these reasons, the network has to be monitored very closely, and also to provide for guaranteed SLAs, and also these solutions must be Industry 4.0 compliant. James, next slide, please. So where does Keysight play? We are a test and measurement company. We are arguably number 1 in the industry today with 5G solutions. We have solutions for all those phases. Like James mentioned, we play vertically and also horizontally in providing these solutions in the build phase, deploy phase, and also in the run phase. Next slide, please, James. And this is a comprehensive view of our solutions without going into the details of these solutions. At a high level, we have solutions to assure the quality of the devices, the RAN network, the core network, and also the live network monitoring, including the mobile edge cloud QoE assurance. That completes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Jagadish. I think that that really covers the kind of nitty-gritty of private 5G, if you will. Thank you. Again, we will pick up on some of that, but just to keep rolling, I would like to introduce Kathiravan, or KK, in charge of product management at Syniverse, who can talk around this this topic of public network, private network, roaming and interplay, which is, I would suggest, a topic which has come very quickly into sight over the last kind of 12 months or so. But Kathiravan, it's over to you.
Yep, thank you, James, and good day. Happy Thursday, everyone. Really happy to be here. If you take to the next slide, please, James, I would start talking a little bit about Syniverse. So Syniverse is a communications technology company. We seamlessly connect the world's multiplying networks and devices, and that will become a bit more clear as we go through the following slides. We deliver seamless connectivity for people, devices, and data. And basically what that means is that we connect about 8 billion with a B mobile devices, and that's mainly because we are interconnecting 800 communications providers. We serve the top 10. So we'd like to think that we are powering the digital economy for over 8 billion devices. And really in our context about private networks here, what that means is that Syniverse is a company that works with both mobile operators, carriers, communication service providers on one side, and enterprises on the other side, right? So we sit in the middle, and we are using our position here really to provide that interoperability between enterprise private networks and public networks that is provided by carriers and communication service providers, right? So we really help our customers accelerate their digital transformation. And a lot of our focus is to help them realize new opportunities in areas like IoT, 5G, private networks, messaging, and other emerging technologies. If you take to the next slide, James, thank you. So really, as James has mentioned before, a lot of the focus for our discussion topic today is really on the need for mobility, right? And so what is mobility? So I would start by saying that when, especially here in North America, 2020, CBRS band was made available to, or shared spectrum was made available to enterprises, right? So a lot of the deployment were really island deployments, what we call non-public networks. So a lot of these private networks were built so that both the user plane and data plane really were retained within the premises, right? Nothing leaves that private network. But over the past 18, 24 months, what we have seen is that a natural evolution as enterprises are working closer with communication service providers, and they are expanding the use cases for their IoT and their private networks. So now we are seeing greater education awareness, as well as increased requirements around roaming or mobility. What that means is that if you deploy a private network and you have IoT devices or consumers within the private network, so when they're in the private network, the device is attached to the private network, and it is consuming all the resources within that private network. But mobility means that equipment or that consumer, they are not stationary, they are moving. So a private network is hardy enough. When they move within the private network, you are still going to get your signal connectivity, the radio strength is good enough, you are still covered. But when you leave the private network, and for those use cases especially, that requires continued connectivity, right? So that's when the aspect of mobility and roaming comes in. This chart here really talks about, where from Syniverse and our engagement with communication service providers and our engagement with, multitude of SIs and enterprises is the need to, moving away from islands into some sort of a requirement where the device, when it leaves, it still requires connectivity, and then leveraging the carrier's macro network for that connectivity, right? So that's roaming out. And then lately, now we are also seeing the ability to roam in, meaning once you have this mobility and the ability to roam out, then there is also the potential to have inbound and outbound roaming between the private network subscribers as well as the MNO subscribers, right? So if I'm operating a private network, obviously I would want my devices and my consumers, when they leave my private network, to still have connectivity. And of course, this is dependent on the use case. At the same token, maybe I would want visitors or different type of devices that is coming in from the macro network. When they come into my private network, how do I enforce the right policies? How do I enforce the right security to give them access if that is needed, right? So this is really charting the evolution on private network use cases that we are seeing. If we take to the next slide, James. So where do we see this requirement? And I'm happy to note that this actually pretty much mirrors the chart that Leo had presented earlier when he presented his verticals. So we are seeing a lot of increased demand for mobility these days. I mean, some of the easy use cases would be like transportation logistics, when you have a truck or you have a package, when it is within the distribution center, it is covered totally by, traditionally it used to be Wi-Fi, but now it is, evolving into a private network coverage. And then when it leaves that private network, then, leveraging a carrier network, a macro network, in order to have that continued coverage. Some of the key things here is, of course, the discussion, like, if I have a private network, how private do I want my private network to be? I know that's a mouthful, but the whole aspect of private network is because I am prioritizing a few things. Either I'm prioritizing latency, maybe all my applications are residing on the private network. Maybe there's high bandwidth, low latency requirements. But then there's also a hybrid model, right? So there are solutions today that even when my devices leave my private network, the ability to bring that data back onto my applications privately and securely, right? So this is just a couple of verticals that we are seeing. One of the areas where Syniverse in particular, we are getting a lot of traction lately is with power utility and energy companies. There's also a lot of, I would say at this stage, a lot of education and initial RFI, RFP areas that you're working on in really trying to figure out, okay, how can they leverage private network deployment that can be used for a lot of their use cases. One of the key things that I would like to share, I think, like, if 18 months ago or 24 months ago, we were under the impression that private networks would be driven largely by devices, IoT devices, right? But late last year, there was a study that showed that for private networks, if we looked at the devices, it was more or less split evenly between, IoT devices with consumer devices like UEs, cell phones, smartphones, tablets, and laptops. So that is just showing that, quite unpredictably, a lot of these private network use cases, they have a consumer behind it, right? So it's a person instead of just a device. And I think that's an interesting evolution of how the enterprises are learning and leveraging a lot of these private network capabilities. If we go to the next slide, James. Thank you. So, when we look at the ability of devices moving from private network to public network, there are a couple of challenges. Again, I want to reiterate that when private networks were initially deployed, it is largely based on the premise that it's a private network, right? I can control who has access to these network resources, right? So that enterprise can literally state only these devices can consume these private network resources. Once they leave my private network, they are no longer connected. So it's almost like firewalled in. It is contained within within my borders. But now when we talk about private network extending that connectivity, leveraging a macro public network, then we need to ask the question, okay, is this still secure? Does that mean my private network is not private anymore? Am I opening up my private network for anyone to walk in and consume my resources, right? So there are a couple of requirements in how to have this private and public network interoperability done in a really safe, secure way, right? And there are a couple of challenges from an enterprise perspective. So for today's session, while Syniverse works largely with communication service providers as well as enterprises, in today's session, I'm really looking at it, for the challenges from the enterprise perspective, right? So from an enterprise perspective, I guess when their devices leave the safety net of their private network and enters the wild west of the public macro network, then there is the consideration, okay, which network am I going to latch onto? Can I latch onto every network? Do I know which public network gives me the best coverage and service quality? More importantly, how am I going to have this roaming arrangement with macro network? Is it with one of them? Is it with multiple carriers? What if my use case requires for my devices, not just for domestic mobility, but for global mobility, right? So how do I work with someone who can provide me coverage, not only when my devices have crossed the borders in the US, but they have crossed the oceans and they've landed in Europe or Asia. And just because my IoT device will need the macro coverage of different providers, do I need to get into roaming agreements with a multitude of operators? So how do we simplify all of this coverage, connectivity layered on top of, I still want to have my security. I still want to be able to have my ease of management. I still want to be able to apply my security and policy to my devices, even when it leaves my private network. So these are the common questions and challenges for this consideration. If we take to the next slide, James. So here, I'm happy to state that Syniverse is able to crack a lot of these considerations. We are able to apply control, security, policy, and extend that even when those devices leave that private network. In this simple use case here, I'm just for the sake of having something visual, we have a truck that when it is inside a private network A, which is a distribution facility, that truck, obviously, it will have some sort of a cellular connectivity modem, and that can be today physical SIM, it can be eSIM. There are multiple SIM formats that allows for that device to be authenticated within that private network. It will latch on and it will be registered to the private network. So it will work and consume the resources within that private network. Then, of course, when it leaves that private network A, eventually the signal of that private network will fade out. Then the device is now scanning. It's like, hey, I've lost my network connectivity. What am I doing? Let me scan again. So it's re-scanning, and now that device will attach to a macro network. This does not happen automatically, right? This happens when you tell the device, okay, you are allowed to consume macro network resources. And this is the type of solution that Syniverse provides. We provide a single SIM that can work within the private network, and when it leaves the private network and comes out into a macro network, the SIM will now rescan, and it will, of course, it will identify there are multiple macro networks. It will attach to whoever it is allowed to attach to, right? So that an authentication occurs, and when the truck is now moving, it is still connected. Now, going back to the topic of security, so there are several things that we can do to make sure that connectivity from that moving truck, there are ways to bring the data back securely into the enterprise application, right? Today, we have enough solutions and technology that, not just encryption, but, there are a lot of other things that you could do, like private APNs. You could, construct, a secure private connectivity where that data can come back to the enterprise's application without ever touching the public internet. Yes, this can be done, right? Even when the truck is moving, the data can be securely brought back into a enterprise application, whether it's in the enterprise application data center or whether it is in one of the more popular cloud services providers, right? So we can actually bring that data back without touching the public internet. And obviously, the reason you do this are twofold. One, of course, it's security, and two, maybe because it requires lower latency. And just to complete the picture, when the truck arrives on a different location, then the truck will recognize that it is in a different location, and then Syniverse actually offers solutions that where if the truck coming in from the macro network, it is still attached to a macro network carrier, right? But once it arrives into the private network, Syniverse has a technology where the device can now be told, hey, you are now back in a private network coverage area. You can drop your connection to the macro network and you can re-register onto this private network that you are allowed to be attached to. right? So here, so some sort of intelligence where the device actually recognizes when it is in a private network coverage area, when it is in a macro network coverage area. More importantly, it also recognizes when it is an overlapping coverage area. Because when the device is back in my facility, obviously I want it to be attached to my private network, even if there's a macro network coverage is available, right? So there's some sort of intelligence that is built to this here.
Katira,
Yep.
Katira, can I interrupt, if I may? We've got 20 minutes on the clock. Are we nearing the end here?
I'm done. Thank you, James.
Oh, look at that. I've done the same thing. Apologies about that. Look, Katira, and that's really comprehensive, and you've actually, you've answered a bunch of questions I had anyway. So so that's all good. But look, let's go into the Q&A session. Just a reminder why we're here. We're talking private 5G for IoT, plotting timelines, defining applications, and making bets. And just before we do, I'd like to take the opportunity to remind people, if you're unaware, that we have an event next week on Tuesday, May 23rd. It's a day-long affair online, so you can tune in and out as you like from your desk, in your dressing gown if you want. Some of the speakers here today will be in attendance, and you can see on this slide that there is like a, it's like a race car in terms of sponsors and all this kind of stuff. So the content will be good. It's the 4th time we've run this event, and yeah, it should be good. So please, we would love to see you there. In the meantime, I am going to stop the screen share and ask everybody to turn their cameras on. Okay, so we should all be present and correct. So nice to see you all, and thank you for your presentations. We've got some questions coming in. Just to start with, just maybe we'll go to Leo, because Leo, I saw you in Barcelona, I saw you in Hanover, and there's a couple of big trade fairs recently where private 5G, in the first instance was, I would argue, the main topic. In the second instance, I would argue it was Hanover Messe. It was a bit of a sideshow. So it's a different thing, and I wonder if the truth about all of this is somewhere between these two events, and if and if the truth really is closer to Hanover Messe than MWC. Just if you can, just comment on that, the state we're in. How do you assess progress so far? Is it slower than you thought, or is it actually, if you peel back, we are right where we should be?
I mean, that's an interesting point, James, that you raised, right? Because I've experienced the same kind of difference in talk. You are within MWC, you get the traditional telco industry and traditional telco actors talking basically more or less amongst themselves about the capabilities of private networks. In this case, 5G, 4G, 5G, all seemed great and wonderful. Then you see what's happening in Hanover Messe, basically the state of the industry, or the state of the discussion with the industry, is this wall. I know you've phrased it very nicely in one of your articles, this wall of indifference. And I think it's where that's where we are in the market at the moment. At the stage of maturing, the technology is slowly but surely maturing, and so is the understanding of the technology. So everyone knows basically the conceptual story about 5G and private cellular networks has been told. Now what needs to happen is, or now it becomes a question, or one technology among many other technologies. And so the question is not anymore around, oh, private 5G, what can I do with it? Why do I need it? But it's more around enterprises and operators in the industrial space having specific key pain points, and someone needs to be able to address them, be it through 5G, be it through 4G or private cellular in general, or be it through other technologies. So I think that's where we are in the market, and that's where the industry needs to act upon.
So Jagdish, let me bring you in there. I mean, Leo said, I think the numbers were, put me right here, but 50 billion, was it $50 billion or 50 billion units? I can't remember. Of 5G.
Yeah, dollars.
So dollars by 2030, and at which point it overtakes LTE. Does that story tell you how far LTE has come and how far it's gone, or how far 5G has to go? Do you see the difference?
So absolutely. If you think about the private networks today, most of the deployments are on LTE, but the 5G is growing much faster. And so there is a flipping point that would happen sometime next year where most of the new networks would come only on 5G rather than on LTE. And that is the reason. The reason is, if you think of the utilities, for example, there is a life cycle of 10 years, and they don't want to go to 5G because the cost of 5G devices is high. LTE, the performance is good enough for the utilities use case. But if you think of the industrial IoT, the specifications that are released in 16 and the devices and the network that is coming up pretty fast are the central theme of the whole industrial IoT, and they are needed, and LTE would not be sufficient. And so that would pick up by 2030, when we see the world where the use of 5G networks would be as seamless as Wi-Fi today, and the cost would decrease quite a bit compared to today. Then we would see that is possible, maybe a little bit earlier, that we would see that much business transactions going on.
And Jagdish, I mean, I know when we've spoken before, and you know, it's like a two-speed market, right? There is the and if you allow me this, there is IoT for industry. This is a borrowed term actually, versus industrial IoT. And you know, I think you've spoken to me before that the momentum is picking up among what you might call machine manufacturers and torque machines and this kind of stuff. And some of these devices that the driller, you know, which has to drill on an aeroplane or whatever, these are being connected gradually with 5G now. But it's a very different story to the CNC machines. And I think there's a question in here actually about the manufacturing execution systems and this kind of stuff. Just explain when that that hard-nosed kind of industrial IoT, that production line automation, when is that go on 5G?
Absolutely. So I think if you subdivide the use cases in the industries or Industry 4.0, right, there are some basic use cases, I must say, which today are being implemented with Wi-Fi. It can be connecting the tools like the torque machine or the screwdrivers who the assemblers use. Some of them are connected with Wi-Fi today. They are being connected with 5G, which is a simple replacement of the connectivity, but it also provides less interference. You can also manage them remotely. Then the other use case is connecting the human-machine interface with the 5G modems, which enables you to decrease the interruption in the assembly or increase the productivity by replacing or moving the new HMI. Or one of the most important use case that is being used is connecting a 5G connection to the AGVs. And that is rapidly being done wherever they are implementing 5G. However, those use cases are quite different to a 5G modem connected to a PLC, process loop control, or some of the process automation things which decides what to do next. Those are much more critical applications, and if something fails, there is multi-million dollars of loss. So if you subdivide some of these less critical use cases and the more critical use cases, right now 5G is definitely coming in the less critical use cases, and I have been seeing that at our customers. And the more critical applications, like Leo mentioned, it may take some time for people to get used to it and go there.
Yeah. Okay. And it seems to me that Kathiravan, that actually that what you're doing in the market and what you're supplying, the niche that the hole you're filling, as it were, is come about because of this. That actually these kind of you know, IoT for industry or 5G for IoT types of cases, rather than the production line stuff, which will take a village, you know, to put together. It's a much more of an ecosystem play, and all the players have to come together and integrate. What you're providing is a more elegant and simple solution in ways, and that is part of the appeal. Is that correct? And I mean, I think just on the critical note as well, which Jagadish has mentioned earlier before, that there's been a lot of talk in utilities, and I know, and I think you've mentioned there that this redundancy play is valuable. So in terms of critical connectivity, you are delivering that service to an extent.
Yep, true. And one of the things, and I'll go back to Jagadish's example on the energy public sector utility, right? When Syniverse did a trial at an airport, we realized in that particular use case, really the private network was for all type of airport operations, right? Whether it is the flight crew or the loaders, luggage, the trucks, a variety of use cases. One of the things we found out is that when the private network went down, then all of these devices automatically leverage the available public network. It's a redundancy play. And this occurred even when those devices were not moving, right? So typically, and I'm making a clear distinction, James, right? We always say that the private network, public network interoperability is when the device moves. But here in this particular instance in the airport, which then we carried over to the energy utility sector, was that you are deploying a private network, right? And we are assuming that the private network is built, with redundancy, with 5 nines of availability. But one of the inadvertently discovered advantages was that if for whatever reason the private network went down, right, you still had connectivity by leveraging this, public network, which is, which provides an overlapping coverage.
Yeah. Okay. And look, I mean, we have questions coming in. Thank you for them, everybody who's writing these questions in. There are a couple of points about prices, and I don't know how we handle those. I don't know what you can say. I mean, I'd suggest that 5G routers, release 15 5G routers are in the market, and you can go on any electronics distributor and see what they, how they're priced. But there's more going on with regards to the price point thing. I think there's an interesting question here about at what point, what do they need to get to? And I think, Leo, did you talk about this, price points, and I think was it twice the price of an industrial Wi-Fi product?
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I hear from the industry mainly, as that's where you would start that's where they would start considering it.
Yeah.
Right. I think it connects actually, and this is one thing I wanted to pick up from the audience questions actually. It connects to an interesting point, because there was a discussion of there was a question of will people switch from Wi-Fi to cellular, if they don't need mobility, and if Wi-Fi works fine. I think that won't be the case. And I think that's one important realization that the telco industry has done or has had in the past year, that we moved away from this kind of quote unquote panacea, 5G will rip out everything, or everyone will rip out everything, to just deploy a 5G network, is to a much more matured understanding of Wi-Fi will stay. And we need to, the telco industry will need to find a way to converge both technologies, and let them exist or coexist, right?
So KK, I know we've had an interesting discussion about this, how closely they will align, and how unique cellular is, intrinsically unique, and that you can't just remove that. I mean, it is technology at the end of the day. Just share your thoughts on that, because I think it's very interesting. There was an article I wrote. Volkswagen was on stage in Hanover talking about this, and it is something that comes up.
Yep.
Honestly, I'm not sure I understand it well enough, but this kind of integration of Wi-Fi and cellular, how close will they come? Can cellular ever be Wi-Fi like in terms of authorization, authentication?
Yeah. I mean, for the current state, I would state that, first of all, we do not discount that Wi-Fi and cellular technologies can coexist. In fact, we do see there are use cases and applications where enterprises are deploying both Wi-Fi and private networks, right? So it is really, really use case dependent. And then to answer your question is that there are works that's being done today, not only within 3GPP, but also with WBA as an example, where they want to simplify the authentication or use cellular authentication for both cellular as well as Wi-Fi. In some instances, there are already cases that we can cite today. But again, I want to go back, like end of the day, Jagadish was saying that there will be a tipping point at private 5G versus private LTE, right? If we look at majority of the use cases and requirements today, you could actually, use private LTE today if you needed to. You don't have to wait for 5G, right? I'm not discounting that, there is going to be use cases that requires, close to the edge type of latency, using network slicing and so forth. In the same sense, there could be use cases that the enterprises could just use Wi-Fi. Right, we don't discount that, right? What we are saying is that there has to be a really good understanding of, what are all the benefits that a private 5G or private LTE can bring to you. And I believe that is also why most enterprises are often starting with trials first before they go full production.
Jagadish, what do you make of that? And what do you make? I mean, it seems to be accepted now. This idea once that was perhaps promoted by parts of the telecoms community, 5G would kill off Wi-Fi or dominate it or something. I mean, it's not realistic. I think the market accepts that now, that maybe in a greenfield site, maybe you have more dominance of 5G, but just talk about that and actually talk about, what you've already said about, release 16, 17, 18 and this production line IoT. Is that in the end, is that quite niche? Is that quite a niche?
So I think if I start with your first part of the question, will 5G replace Wi-Fi? No one is expecting to replace Wi-Fi at all, because Wi-Fi has unique characteristics of easy to onboard at this moment at least, and the price points are very, very cheap, right? So, and also it has its own use cases, maybe connecting to the laptops, connecting to the human-machine interfaces in some cases, or just having the IT. So I think no one is expecting. One of the biggest disadvantage of Wi-Fi is the interference. And also the latencies that are the reliability. So all the cellular technology advantages that Wi-Fi can provide. And so for the specific use cases where those features are needed, 5G will dominate. There is no doubt about it. And when that will happen, I mean, again, as far as the tipping point, we are already seeing that all the new 5G deployments in industrial IoT are 5G. They're not going with LTE. LTE is mostly for other use cases such as utilities or airports, etc., etc. So the tipping point is, we are in the process of having the tipping point, absolutely sure. But in the industrial IoT, which is a forum today, it takes some time. The features have to come. The release 16 absolutely must come. The URLCC, enhanced URLCC must come. TSN to a certain extent as well. So.
Okay. And Jagadish, I see you typing an answer here, but maybe very quickly, and I'll bring Leo in as well, just on spectrum, which model works best for this? Jagadish,
is it for Leo or for me? Yeah. Oh, no, I was about to type. I was typing, hey, there won't be a single spectrum that will be a winner throughout the world. It don't work like that. Number one, let's take an example of the auto assembly plant. At the end of the assembly, there are many cars that are coming. Then the software has to be flashed inside the car. Which is the best spectrum there? MM wave, right? The MM wave, because of it, huge bandwidth and huge data rates. Now, if you think of the same industry which has, let's say, 10 square kilometers of the area, for the coverage, you need to have sub-6. There won't be a single spectrum that will win, even in private networks. And it also depends, depending upon the country, what kind of spectrum that is allocated. I would say all of them, it absolutely depends upon the use case, but not what the government says it should be.
Leo, do you just on that, do you agree?
I have not much to add to this, other than maybe a brief comment on the role of unlicensed spectrum. I mean, this was very aggressive. I don't want to say aggressively, but advocated by the likes of the Multiplier Alliance, right? I don't see much traction for unlicensed spectrum, because it doesn't really, it combines the worst of both worlds in realistic terms. Now within Europe, I see there's a lot of demand or it seems the regulators are focusing on sub-6 spectrum with 3.8. I mean, the European Commission just not forcing, but convincing its member states to look at 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz spectrum. And then I think we'll see a combination, as Jagadish has said, with different forms of millimeter wave spectrum as well.
Okay, look, I think we're about done. I'm just gonna take it back to Kathiravan just to finish up if we can. And I apologise. I think we've answered most of your questions. I apologise we haven't said more. I think this is a big topic, and we could go on and on. Fortunately, there is a report coming. Fortunately, there's an event coming on Tuesday. Unfortunately, we will hear from Syniverse soon enough. But Kathiravan, just very quickly to wrap up, the market you're in, what you might call an MVNO market, an IoT MVNO market, is busy. I mean, it is very, very busy. And I struggle to distinguish one from the other, really, you know what I mean? So just give us a sense of what is going on here and why, I mean, I guess why Syniverse, if I can give you a platform like that.
Yep. I mean, at end of the day, if I want to simplify this, right, in the terms of private network, public network connectivity, we are talking enterprises and, you know, communication service providers. So it's almost like they speak a different language, because one is so telco centric, right? The other one is so IT centric. And enabling this type of interoperability requires things like, you know, for the enterprises, you know, enabling roaming agreements with individual, you know, carrier partners. You know, how do you do that clearing and settlement, right? Billing. You know, how do you, you know, extend all of these controls from that, you know, public network into a enterprise environment, right? So I think that's where Syniverse comes in, and we traditionally play in our role that we sit in the middle between enterprises and carrier networks, right? We work comfortably with both sides, right? And we're able to extend all of these controls, you know, really API driven to enterprises. So we are just making it simpler for enterprises from both, you know, management as well as, you know, operational perspective, right? And I think, you know, end of the day, it is, you know, how do you add value to enterprises? How do you make their private network deployments, you know, easier to deploy and easier to manage, right? And you don't need to be talking to multiple partners.
Yeah, okay. Look, I'm going to bring it to a close. I'm sorry once again for not giving all of my guests more time, more questions. But the content was dynamite, really good, really appreciate it. So just finally, I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Jagadish at Keysight, Leo at ABI Research, and Kathiravan at Syniverse. Thank you so much for your time and your patience with me. Thank you all for joining us today. Like I say, hopefully see you Tuesday. There is this report coming out as well, so look out for that. And for sure, yeah, we'll catch you soon. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.